And now to Elizabeth Brackett and a look at the state of Chicago charter schools. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Phil. Well, does Chicago need more charter schools? Last week, the Chicago School Board said, not at the moment. The board tabled a request for 3 new charters and the expansion of 2 others. This came after critics complained charters were draining kids and resources from traditional Chicago public schools. The Renaissance 2010 initiative that opened 103 new schools, most of them charters, has now ended. Though the Renaissance 2010 Fund wants to raise $40 million to fund new charters over the next 5 years. But recent research suggests there is little difference in achievement gains between students in charter schools and in public schools. And now here to talk about charter schools are Phyllis Lockett, the president and CEO of the Renaissance Schools Fund, and Steve Tozier, a professor in policy studies in the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And thanks to you for coming in on this difficult evening, I hear, with the weather. Well, Phyllis Lockett, when the school board tabled discussion on these charters last week, the school board president, Karen Lewis, Teachers Union President Karen Lewis, said, and we did invite her tonight, but she couldn't make it. She said, well, today the board heard what the community has been saying. They want improved neighborhood schools and not the charter model. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Elizabeth, I have to note that charter schools are public schools, and they are serving all children across Chicago, particularly in the underserved communities where we have helped open charter schools. The school board, from my understanding, is still very much behind charter schools, and we suspect that these schools will be approved early next year.
Well, Steve Tozier, tell us what the research says about how well students in charter schools perform versus students in regular public schools. Although you're right, charter schools are still public schools, but charter public schools versus regular public schools.
Yeah, I think the first most important thing to say is that we should be careful about listening to anybody who says the research is conclusive on this on either side, because it still isn't conclusive. You can find examples of major studies or smaller studies that show just what you said, which is that charter schools students are not learning at any faster or higher rate than kids in regular public schools. In fact, there was a study just done this week in Milwaukee that demonstrated just about this thing. On the other hand, what you see is people lined up to debate the methodology of the studies and whether in fact the studies are fairly represented and so on.
Given what you know, what would you say? You can't reach a firm conclusion, but what is the trend, or where are we going in terms of trying to compare the two?
I'd say that first of all, it is important to keep studying what the results are. And secondly, we're learning some things about schools partly by studying charter schools that we're learning by studying regular public schools, such as the debate between charter schools and regular public schools might be a red herring. It might be forcing us to look in the wrong direction. That what we find is that whether it's a charter or a regular school, the same kinds of things drag a school down or support a student for high quality learning.
But when you evaluate what you've done over the past 10 years, what have you found in terms of results?
Well, yeah, we look at the data, the state data and the data that's published by the Chicago Public Schools, which show that charter elementary schools perform 11% better versus their neighborhood counterparts. High schools perform 14% better. But the most important statistic is they graduate more kids and they send more children to college. That is, by and large, the biggest result that we've seen. And a national study that was well respected that identified 5 cities where charter schools significantly outperformed their neighborhood counterparts included Chicago. I think the studies that Steve refers to basically compare charter schools to all Chicago public schools, or all public schools in a particular district, which includes selective enrollment schools, which we don't think is a fair apples-to-apples comparison, because that's not where we're putting charters. We're putting charter schools in communities that need them the most, where schools have been failing for decades.
But are you putting charter schools in communities that need them the most? There was another study that Catalyst did, or a report really that Catalyst did, saying that in the charter schools, wrong number, most charter schools in neighborhoods that really need them don't get them. 11 of 25 high-need communities in Chicago did not get charter schools, and therefore the resources that go into charters weren't available for those communities.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is when we initiated this effort 5 years ago, there were 27 communities that needed high-performing school options. So the fact that in 5 years that we've addressed almost half of those communities, that's a great thing. We need more. So the answer is not to say charters aren't doing enough. It's that we need more so more communities can be served.
So what do you say? Does Chicago need more charter schools?
First of all, I think one sort of takeaway that we have from the discussion so far ought to be the following. Some charter schools do quite well. I mean, in fact, some of the principals that are in my program that I'm working with are heads of those charter schools. Some charter schools do very badly. Now, it's also true of public schools. We have some exemplary public schools in low-income neighborhoods in Chicago where low-income kids are performing at very, very high levels. In both of these kinds of schools, charter and regular schools, where kids are performing at very, very high levels, one of the things that the Consortium in Chicago School Research tells us is present in all of these schools is outstanding leaders in the schools. And so one of the things that I think is terribly important to focus on is not whether we need more charter schools or not, but whether we need more outstanding leaders for schools of all kinds. And the answer to that is unequivocally yes.
But so, given the fact that you want to raise $40 million for new charters primarily, right?
Absolutely.
If what you're saying is what really makes the difference is good leadership, whether or not it's in a charter school or in a neighborhood school, do we need to have $40 million going into just charters?
You know, I think we need support for leadership in our traditional schools and charter schools, but we need more charter school options. And I'll tell you why. Charters, and a great example of this is North Lawndale College Prep. The principal for North Lawndale College Prep is part of Steve's program, for example. And its performance is not great, but it has the highest percentage of graduates in non-selective enrollment schools, and it also has the highest percentage of college persistence of students in a non-selective Chicago public school. That makes all the difference in the world. So and charters are able to do that because they have the flexibility to set the right culture. They can employ who they want. They can incent teachers in a much more flexible manner. They can get rid of teachers who aren't performing well. They can adjust their school day. Our schools are open 90 minutes longer on average than a traditional Chicago public school. If you cumulate that up from kindergarten to 12th grade, students are getting 5.5 years more of instruction. That is the big difference. And so we need high quality charter schools. We need high quality public schools. We believe that we've got to do both, but we are not going to inherently stop the charter school movement because there are those who would prefer those dollars going to public schools. We are serving children. So it's not about the vehicle, it's about what is working effectively for children.
But what about the persistent argument that those resources that are going into your charter schools, why shouldn't all kids get 90 minutes more of instruction or 5.5 years more of instruction? Why shouldn't that be available for all kids in Chicago public schools? Steve?
Well, I think that you're putting your finger on an important thing, which is what's the theory by which we think we will move from a minority of charter schools to all schools operating at the level that the very best of the charter schools do? And we don't have a good theory for that right now. In other words, continuing to convert schools to charter schools or create new charter schools until all 650 schools in Chicago are charter schools, that's not a theory that anybody is seriously putting forward. In fact, today, approximately 3% of schools in America are charter schools. And so for me, part of the problem here is that we get distracted by this charter versus regular public debate. I think what the example Phyllis just gave us starts to illustrate why we should value at least some charter schools, because they can demonstrate some things that we can learn from for all public schools. But it's also the case that there are some outstanding public schools that are, that are non-charters that are producing phenomenal results as well.
But are Chicago public schools losing resources because of charters?
I think that you're going to find an argument on either side of that. For example, if Phyllis is successful and her team is successful at helping another $40 million be raised over and above that money is not likely to come directly from Chicago Public Schools. On the other hand, this issue came up in the Milwaukee public school system, where there's serious arguments about the extent to which the raising of a new $40 million on the one hand actually creates a drain of resources on the other. I think Phyllis has made an important point. It's one that I would want to underscore, which is that anything that we can do to create better schools for kids needs to be taken seriously. Then we have to look, when we look at those benefits, at what are the costs. And I'll tell you one major cost for me of the charter school movement, and that is that it tends to distract us from these larger questions of scale. The question is, how are charter schools being positioned in the debate about school reform? For example, a president who I voted for, Barack Obama, when asked what should we do with American public schools, all too frequently reduces his answer to charter schools and alternative routes to teacher certification. These two answers are not going to, in fact, provide what we need at scale. What we need at scale is going to have to be better teaching, better leadership, in all schools, and we do know a lot about how to accomplish that. Charter schools are not the central vehicle for pulling that off.
Well, the other thing President Obama says, because of Arne Duncan, is that the model that we've created here in Chicago has basically gone to Washington and is being utilized nationwide. And the concern is, if that model has so much emphasis on charter schools, is that the way we want to go to reach the goals that Steve was talking about, which is really better education for all kids?
Sure. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, it's not a matter of increasing the option for families who literally don't have options right now. For more charter schools is draining the public school system is ridiculous. It really is about what is the best option to serve children more effectively. And so I think the zero-sum argument is raised by folks who really want to defend the status quo. And I think you know, we have got to invest resources in areas that are best serving children. The dollars that we raise are private funding. This is not Chicago Public School funding. And I also want to note that the charters are getting about 80 cents on the dollar to what Chicago Public Schools receive, and they're not, in most cases, receiving facilities. They're going in the private market. So they are delivering, in my opinion, a much better product much more efficiently.
So where are you going to be able to raise $40 million in this economy over the next 5 years? And if this doesn't work, if it doesn't go away, are you saying that that would be $40 million that would be accessible to Chicago Public School students that won't be there?
Well, you know, and we're still working through the numbers, and we'll have an appropriate announcement, you know, sometime next year. But the dollars will be coming from the corporate business community, the foundation community. There are many individuals who believe education is the most important thing we can be working on. And so the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club, which really has been a stalwart champion of this effort, it inherently launched this effort, will be behind this work.
Steve?
This would be a fun experiment, which is that we take that 40 million and give 20 to me to create programs to develop stronger principles for Chicago Public Schools, and 20 to Phyllis and her team, and see what kind of results we get in the long run. I think that the next 10 years will not show, for example, that charter schools are an effective way to reform American public schooling at scale. I think the next 10 years will show that the single most cost-effective thing that we know how to do to improve public schools at scale in low-performing neighborhoods is, in fact, through improving school leadership. The single most cost-effective lever we have. And when that issue is carted off to the side because we're focusing on our charters working, then that's a problem. Let's focus on the single most cost-effective lever that we have right now, because it's not expensive and we already know the results.
Do you think the Chicago School Board will approve these charters eventually?
I do.
All right. Well,
Absolutely.
on that note, my many thanks to Phyllis Lockett and Steve Tozier.